According to St. John, the 20th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O
Christ. Well, a few weeks ago, I finally got around to going and getting my eyes checked, because it had been a couple of years and I started to realize that there was something wrong with my iPhone. The screen was getting smaller and smaller, and I was having difficulty reading the screen. And when I went to finally see the eye doctor, she told me that in fact I had developed a little bit of a vision problem. That presbyopia, that condition that you get when you reach middle age and you start to have difficulty seeing the stuff in front of you, was starting to creep up on me. And that if I wanted to continue to read small print for long periods of time, I was probably going to need to get some reading glasses. So in a kind of surrender to the advance of age, I went out and bought my very first pair of reading glasses to deal with my vision problem. But you know, lots of us have vision problems. Thomas, in today's gospel reading, also had a vision problem. But Thomas's vision problem wasn't just something with his eyes, even though at first glance, when you read this story, it may seem to be. I suspect, though, that the real vision problem that Thomas had was deeper than just his eyes. And I suspect it wasn't just Thomas. I think it was all of the disciples. All of the disciples had this vision problem. And finally seeing Jesus, having their eyeballs process the image of the risen Jesus in front of them, did not fully solve their vision problem. And this is why. The vision problem that the disciples had was fully grasping this vision of new life that had really, really changed. That what had happened in Jesus' resurrection was not just that Jesus was bodily alive again, but rather that God was ushering in a completely and dramatically changed world and changed life for all of the disciples. That's what Jesus was really showing the disciples when he showed himself to be alive. He was showing them that their lives and the world around them had been completely and dramatically changed. And that was a change that was difficult to envision. None of the disciples were quite sure what to make of it, and that is why, even a week later, when Jesus appears for the second time, the disciples who had seen him a week before on Easter Sunday evening were still sitting on their hands in the house. They hadn't moved because they weren't sure what to make of it all. You see, Jesus' resurrection was not just the promise that someday when the disciples died, they'd go to heaven and be with Jesus. In all of the resurrection accounts, Jesus never once says, hey, sit tight, believe in me, so that when you die, you'll go to heaven. Even though a lot of times, that's how we read the resurrection accounts. That's not what Jesus says. Instead, he says stuff like this. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. Get up. Get going. Live right now in the new life that God is giving you. The resurrection starts now. As what some of our confirmation material says, why wait until you die to start the party? But how do you envision that new life, that new reality that you're supposed to live into? It was hard for those first disciples. It was hard often for them for a long, long time. It's hard for us sometimes. It's the vision problem that we all have. So it was tough for those first disciples, and it can be tough for us. But you know, I think from this story, we can start to get a little bit of a glimpse of how Jesus began to kind of correct that vision problem for them. And sometimes, I think for the disciples, and maybe for us too, the vision problem gets corrected when we start to be willing to imagine things that we had not considered before. See, in spite of the fact that before Easter we were reading gospel stories in which Jesus said to his disciples, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to die, and on the third day I'm going to rise from the dead, not a single one of the disciples actually expected that to happen. There is not a single story in which Jesus appears to any of the disciples and they say to him, "Oh, what took you so long? We've been waiting for you. We're sitting here expecting you to rise from the dead." Maybe they didn't hear. Maybe they didn't understand. Maybe they thought it was all a metaphor. Maybe they weren't sure what to make of it. But what happened when Jesus showed himself to be alive to those disciples was not that suddenly they became theological geniuses and they now understood all these things about God and Jesus that they never had before. Rather, what happened was in seeing the risen Jesus in front of them, they saw something that they had never even imagined, that they had never thought was possible. And that was what started, I think, to spark their imaginations. They started to be able to think, wow, if God can do this, what else can God do? What else is God doing in my life? How is God changing the world? And they began to at least get a glimpse that sparked their imagination to begin to understand how God could be doing something they had never even imagined before. And sometimes that's the way it works for us. When we're looking for the new things and the new ways that God is breathing life into our lives, we got to just catch a glimpse of something that allows you to figure out how God could actually be doing something that you had not imagined before. On this Creation Care weekend, I was thinking a lot about the ways that life has changed, in fact, in the way that we care for creation, that we are a little bit better about the way we use energy, how we recycle, and things like that. And I was thinking back over 20 years ago when I went to visit a friend of mine from college who lives in Germany. And on that trip, I remember one of the first things that I learned was that you could not throw stuff out. I mean, you couldn't just throw stuff in the trash. Everything got recycled. And you had to separate all kinds of stuff. There was green glass, and brown glass, and clear glass. The plastic that you had your yogurt in, that went in another container, and the little foil top from it, that went in someplace else. And I remember looking at that, and watching that, and having to live with that for a couple of weeks, and going, that would never work here. We just would never be able to do stuff like that. But I saw how something could work in another way. I saw how people could live in a different way, and it at least allowed me to start to think about a possibility that I had not envisioned before. That's what Jesus was doing for those first disciples when he appeared in front of them. He was sparking their imagination about what God was doing that could be possible in their lives that they had not thought about before. And sometimes when we open our eyes and see the stuff God's doing in our lives, sometimes that's what God's doing. given us a vision, starting a vision, correcting the vision problem of what could be in our lives. Sometimes, I think for the disciples and for us, what Jesus was doing to correct their vision problem was simply to help the disciples to be able to invest emotionally and get excited about what God was doing in their lives. You know what changed for those first disciples on Easter evening, the ones who first saw Jesus, was not that they suddenly understood how people could come back from the dead or what all that kind of stuff was all about, but they experienced Jesus. And it made them just drop everything else that they were thinking about, worried about, working on, and they were excited about it. And Thomas came back and they went, "We've seen the Lord. It's great. It's cool." And Thomas says, "You know, guys, I'm tired. I'm white." Thomas gets a bad rap because he wasn't in the house. But he's probably not in the house because he was the only one brave enough to go out and do the grocery shopping and risk his life to get the food they needed, or to pass notes or messages to other small bands of Jesus' disciples who were also cowering and hiding inside the house. And he comes back. Have you ever done this where you come back home and you've been out, and you've been running the errands, you've been exhausted, it's terrible, it's horrible, and somebody says to you, "Hey, guess what? We got a cool new opportunity here." And you go, "Oh, that's nice, but I'm just too tired to deal with it right now." And I think that's where Thomas was. And what Jesus did when he appeared to Thomas was not simply to give him kind of a vision in his eyeballs of Jesus being alive, but rather to help Thomas be able to invest emotionally in what God was doing in his life. To make it possible for Thomas to say, "You know what, I can drop all that other stuff that I was doing, my agendas, my worries, all these kinds of things, and be able to see new possibilities and new opportunities." And I think sometimes that's how God corrects our vision problem. When God kind of yanks us out of our daily routines, the stuff that's dragged us down, and frees us so that we can actually be invested in the new stuff and the new opportunities God is doing in our lives. And sometimes also, I think Jesus is helping to correct our vision problem as he did for the first disciples, when Jesus calls us to actually live into this new reality, this new life that has begun even now. You know, the disciples had trouble with this. This is why I think they still had the vision problem, because they were still sitting in the house, at least as Luke tells the story, for another 7 weeks before they decided to actually venture out, take that first step, and say, "Okay, let's actually try to live in this new way because of what we know God has begun to do in Jesus." And it was when they started to take the steps out that they actually started to experience that new life. I think that works the same way for us. There are so many Christians who think, you know, I would love to be able to live into this new reality God is creating, but I don't understand it, I can't see it, I can't figure it out. But if you would make me a chart and a diagram and label everything on the spreadsheet and I could see the picture of it, then I'm willing to take the first step and try. But sometimes for us too, it's taking those first few steps that actually enables us to catch the vision and to see what God is doing. I remember back to when I was in Germany 20-some years ago, and I was watching all of this crazy stuff with the recycling, and I thought, Right when I got back, that was about the time that PG County and Montgomery County started to do curbside recycling, and you started to do it. And I remember all the people that were like, "I don't want to have to wash my trash and do that kind of stuff. Why do I have to do that?" But we started doing it. We actually started to recycle some stuff and put those things in there. And it was in those first few steps of actually doing it that I started to experience, oh, here's how life could live a different way. And I have gotten to the point in my life where I am able to recycle so much stuff and compost so much stuff that I create so little trash in my house I forget what day trash day is. And I got to remember that because the raccoons remind me when I haven't taken out the trash and they get in there and stuff like that. But it's a new way of living that I wouldn't have figured out if I wasn't willing to take those first few steps. And sometimes what God's doing in our lives is calling us to take those steps so that we can begin to see and experience the new life God has in mind for us. And sometimes that's the way that Jesus is working to correct our vision problem. You see, I think throughout Easter, all these Easter stories we have, what Jesus is really doing is working to correct the vision problem that the disciples had. And he's doing the same thing for us each and every day. Jesus is working to correct our vision problem, and sometimes that means that for us too, we just got to keep our eyes open so that we can see some of the new things that God is doing in our lives and spark our imaginations to new possibilities. Sometimes for us too, it means simply opening our hearts to becoming excited and invested in some of those new possibilities. And sometimes, most of all, it means being willing to take those first few steps, to live in some new ways, so that we too can be people who can really see and really experience the new life that Jesus has for us right now, not just at the end of time.